Hello, my name's Harry Newman and I'm a lecturer in Shakespeare and early modern literature here at Royal Holloway, where I teach a number of undergraduate and postgraduate courses on Shakespeare. Today I want to make some suggestions about how to teach character in Shakespeare, and I've got 5 tips for you. So number 1 is characters are not real people. And I know that seems like a very obvious statement to make, but I think it can be very tempting for students, as it was for critics in the early 20th century, to talk about Shakespearean characters as if they somehow exist outside of the text being studied. And with that comes a tendency, I think, to speculate about the background or backstory of particular characters. So people wonder about how many children Lady Macbeth had, or what Cordelia's life was like growing up with Goneril and Regan and so on. And I think it's very important to make sure students don't fall into that trap, which can really shift focus away from the text under discussion. In truth, of course, characters are not real people, but they're dramatic representations of real people. Illusions, if you like, that are created through little tricks of language and action in performance on stage. So even the character of Hamlet, for example, who's often seen as the most developed of Shakespeare's characters, is in fact a kind of series of theatrical effects, a kind of things that are based on the actor's ability to create physical and audible signs, so costumes, gestures, movements, sounds, and so on. And those things are legible to an audience. They can be read by the audience. And in fact, that's the original meaning of character. It's an inscribed or marked symbol or a piece of writing that can be read. That's what a character was. So when early in the play Hamlet tells his mother Gertrude, "I have that within which passes show," he's gesturing, of course, to an ocean of emotion beyond what he outwardly does and says. But of course, no character in reality has that within which passes show, because characters are all surface by definition. They are only what can be shown externally. And I think it's difficult to accept that idea, especially when you're watching a really compelling performance of Hamlet, for instance. But part of understanding what a play is, I think, is recognizing that character depth, as it's sometimes called, is a kind of imaginative product of theatrical representation. And that brings me to my second point, which is depth isn't everything. Shakespeare has this reputation for creating characters with interiority and psychological depth, but it's really worth encouraging your students to recognize the powerful dramatic functions and effects of characters who, at first hand, don't seem to have that psychological depth. They seem to be somewhat flat. So consider, for example, in Titus Andronicus, the character of Lavinia, who doesn't speak much in the first part of the play. After she is raped and has her tongue cut out, of course she doesn't speak at all. But Lavinia is extremely important in the play because she has an iconic function. She's representative of mutilation, destruction, lost innocence, for example. And she's key in that different characters read and misread her body in different ways. And in that sense, she's essential to the progression of the plot. My next point is that Shakespeare didn't call characters characters. Character is a word that's first applied to drama in the late 17th century by someone called John Dryden. In Shakespeare's time, in the late 16th and early 17th century, characters weren't characters, but they were persons. Sometimes they're called dramatis personae, sometimes they're called the persons who speak. And I think that's indicative of how character was understood at the time. Literally, a person was a mask. Persona was Latin for the masks worn by ancient Roman actors. And in a sense, I suggest that Renaissance acting, or personation as it was sometimes called, was often understood as a kind of mask wearing, gesturing back to the idea I brought up earlier of character being all surface. So whereas today we tend to think of character as something that is fixed and perhaps deep-rooted, perhaps in the Renaissance they thought of character as something that's more of a kind of transient vehicle or costume that could be inhabited by an actor. And Renaissance audiences were aware that the actor was always just beneath the surface, and in fact they may have seen that actor play a different character the day before. And I think that brings me nicely to my fourth point, which is focus on meta-theatrical moments. Meta-theatre is anything in theatre which draws attention to acting's unreality or artifice, and reminds the audience that in fact they are an audience and that they're experiencing a dramatic fiction in a thing that we call a playhouse. Meta-theatre is often achieved through what's called a play within a play, that is, a play performed within the theatrical fiction of the play. So think of the mousetrap in Hamlet, or Pyramus and Thisbe in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Often creates what's called a Russian doll effect, where you have these endless layers of reality and theatricality. Meta-theatre is also achieved through language, so think about Jaquiz's speech in As You Like It, beginning, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. That reminds us that we are an audience watching an actor performing as a character. And in a sense it makes it impossible for us to suspend our disbelief, as Samuel Taylor Coleridge put it. Also think about prologues, epilogues, asides, soliloquies, those speeches where the characters turn to the audience and speak directly to them, reminding them that they are in fact an audience participating in a theatrical fiction. I think all of these meta-theatrical moments are useful for thinking about character because they show that characterization is not always entirely realistic or a kind of waterproof illusion. They show that those identities of the actor and the character that actor is playing is often fractured. And I think that fracture in Renaissance drama is often intentional. It's made us to think about an actor being made up of an actor beneath the surface who's putting on this performance. So when Coriolanus tells the Senate that showing his wounds to the people in order to become consul is a part that I shall blush in acting, we're made to think of the actor playing him, which in Shakespeare's time was probably Richard Burbage, the lead actor of Shakespeare's acting company, The King's Men, and a great celebrity of the time. Coriolanus often uses anti-theatrical rhetoric, so he's disgusted at the very thought of pretending to be someone that he's not. But in using that language, he highlights the irony of the fact that he is being played by an actor, and I think that irony is especially poignant in performance. And that brings me to my final point, which is show your students clips of Shakespeare in performance. Of course, characters function very differently on the page and on the stage, or perhaps I should say screen if you're watching filmic productions of the plays. A good exercise I always find, if you do a close reading exercise with your students of a particular passage or scene from a Shakespeare play, get them some questions to do in groups and to respond to, and even ask them to insert in square brackets, as you often find in modern editions, stage directions and asides. Then show them a clip, perhaps using a YouTube clip, of that particular passage, and see how watching it in performance changes their responses to those questions and changes their responses to the characters. I think that can be incredibly revealing and can emphasize the fact that these plays were written to be performed. I think I'll leave it there. So those are my 5 tips for teaching character in Shakespeare.